Offshore Observation Special Interest Group, discussion of SZ4D's plans for offshore Cascadia. I think most people know what CRESCENT is, but it's a NSF-funded hazard center interested in earthquake hazards in Cascadia, and it has basically 3 goals: to develop a better scientific understanding of Cascadia subduction zone earthquake hazards, to train the next generation of diverse geoscientists, and to promote collaborations and communications with the agencies responsible for sort of managing hazards and with the public. And really pleased that CRESCENT's helping organize this meeting, and should acknowledge Jill Elizabeth and Amanda Erickson in the CRESCENT office for running this effort. CRESCENT has lots of components, which I'm not going to talk about, but one of them, and perhaps one of the most nebulous, is an offshore observation special interest group. And, we have aspirational goals to gather broad community input on observational needs and priorities offshore in Cascadia, and identify specific areas for accelerated progress through coordination and the development of collaborations that link the scientific community to federal agencies, stakeholders, private companies, and international partners. We have a web page on the CRESCENT site. If you search for CRESCENT Offshore Observations, you will find us. And we have administrative support for meetings like this, and we have funding for one meeting, which will probably occur towards the end of next calendar year. If you go to the website, you will find an expression of interest form, which quite a lot of people have completed. But that's a great way to indicate your interest in this group and what you'd like us to do. And I'd ask people to complete that probably by the end of November, if you haven't done so already, because at some point it will disappear. We have a nascent leadership group, which is basically the subset of people who completed the expression of interest form early, indicated an interest in joining the leadership group, and then could make the first Zoom meeting. So it's certainly something over the next month or two that I want to go more systematically through the people who completed that and sort of build out an open leadership group for this effort. In our first organizational meeting, I think we agreed that our initial priority would be to reach out to SZ4D, because I think that's very timely. As I'm sure people know, SZ4D is a community-driven initiative which is sort of seeking to develop a long-term interdisciplinary program to understand the limits and possibilities of predicting subduction zone hazards. Their efforts are primarily focused in Chile, but they also have significant components in Cascadia and Alaska. And they are moving towards a mid-scale infrastructure proposal to NSF, which I think will get their observations off the ground. It was completely inadvertent that we scheduled this meeting at the same time as another SZ4D meeting, which is why this one's being recorded and the other's being recorded, so that you can go and listen to the other one. But I am really pleased that Diana Roman of Carnegie Science, Jeff Freymueller of Michigan State University, and Doug Wiens of Washington University have agreed to participate in the meeting. And the format is that Diana Roman will give about a 20-minute presentation on SZ4D and its plans offshore in Cascadia. We'll then have a question and answer, and I think you can put questions in the chat or the Q&A box, or maybe raise your hand. And once we've gone through those, we'll then form breakout groups where we can sort of discuss priorities for offshore observations in Cascadia and potential synergies with SZ4D. And then we'll have a very brief plenary where people have a minute to summarize what each breakout group does. So without doing any more, I'll just turn it over to Diana to give her presentation.
Okay. Thank you, William, and good to see you all. Thank you for attending. And I was saying as people were coming in, this is actually really timely and useful to SZ4D as well. So we really appreciate the opportunity to engage with you. I'm Diana Roman. I'm the vice chair of SZ4D, and I'm also the PI for our intended MSRI2 submission. I'm a volcanologist and a land person by training. It's been a lot of fun getting up to speed on offshore instrumentation and infrastructure, but we have several folks from SZ4D here, including the co-chairs of our Operations Planning for Infrastructure Committee, Doug and Jeff, and so they'll help out in the questions with some technical things. I'm going to try to go through this fairly quickly with minimal detail, and then you can ask for additional detail in the questions if you like. So just as a sort of broad picture of what SZ4D is, it's a big multi-armed effort at this point. We are not one proposal or one thing. We are a very grassroots and distributed network, but basically what we do, what we focus on, or what we kind of divide ourselves into instrumentation and activities. And so I'm going to mostly talk about the instrumentation today, the plans for the observational arrays in Chile and 2 domestic targets. And then we also have a large number of activities, obviously the analysis of the data, field efforts, modeling, laboratory work, training, and outreach. So this is kind of the sum total of SZ4D as it stands. As William mentioned, our instrumental efforts are primarily focused in Chile, but we have identified 2 domestic targets, Cascadia and the Alaska Aleutian subduction zones. And our portfolio is a little bit different between those sites in terms of intended instrumentation and activity. So our steering committee has recommended that the vast majority of the instrumentation be sited in Chile, but that there's much more of a balance between especially Chile and Cascadia in terms of activities that's working on existing data and so on. Really what we're trying to do in SZ4D is use the Chilean subduction zone as the place where things happen quickly, they happen at large scales, as a sort of global perfect analog for subduction zones with less frequent or smaller processes. So what we're really trying to do in SZ4D is make sure that our observations can happen over a time scale where we can learn big things, but they are also transferable and applicable to subduction zones worldwide, and especially the domestic subduction zones. So that's really the link, the most important link for us between Chile and our other targets. To give you an overview, so I'll repeat the apology that was on my part for double booking with our activities town hall, where a lot of discussion of the other activities in SZ4D is going on right now, and we will make that recording available in the slides. So I apologize for that. But I wanted to put up this sort of multi-level timeline that basically covers everything that more or less SZ4D is funded or hopes to be funded to do. Until up to now, we've largely been funded by what we refer to as our Catalyst grant. This work is mostly completed, but it was a follow-on to our RCN and was basically the next level of planning for all of our efforts, beginning to develop a budget for the MSRI and so on. Our main funded effort right now is called SZNet. There's a lot of discussion of SZNet going on in the activities town hall. This is our international and domestic coordination network of networks arm. We run international field trips, student exchanges between the US and Chile, workshops, webinars, and so on. So that's a large effort, and there's a lot of really great things happening now through SZNet. We have some smaller or more targeted efforts that are either funded or have been submitted, including work on modeling, work on field efforts, potential imaging efforts, and so on. We recently this year submitted a geohazard center proposal to begin doing collaborative science and basically to start to really develop a multi-hazard science. This is what SZ4D is trying to do, to look at the interconnected hazards in the context of the subduction zone. And so that has quite a lot of activities. There's kind of a broad overview here. That proposal is pending, but it is our sort of move from planning into science. And then finally, most of what I'm going to be talking about is our MSRI2, our infrastructure effort. So just coming back to SCNet, I want to point out this is basically a network of networks, and I want to point out that CRESCENT is a member network of SCNet, and so this is our maybe formal way to interact between our two initiatives. And as I said, there are a lot of things going on there, but just if you're unaware that CRESCENT is actually part of SCNet, it is. We have other partners around the world, and we have other initiatives like Converse, which is a volcano initiative in the US that are partners in this. Okay, so that brings me to the rest of what I'm going to talk about, which is our effort toward building the SZ4D multi-hazard array, and how we are planning to do this through an MSRI2 submission. So you can see the timeline down here. This is a very long-term thing, both in planning and in execution, should it be funded. But we are working very heavily on this right now, and so this is a really good time for us to engage with your community and hear input from this community. This is very much a community effort. We want to make sure that the science we are designing is what the community wants, and that the community can use ultimately to do its science. So this is a very important time to engage with us. I want to talk a little bit about what the MSRI2 is or has been. This is a fairly recent program at NSF. It's gone through, I think, 3 cycles at this point. It stands for Mid-Scale Research Infrastructure. There's an MSRI1 that is a smaller budget cap, up to 20 million. It can also support design proposals. But we are targeting the MSRI2, which supports the implementation or construction of research infrastructure, and at a total budget cap up to $100 million. The MSRI2 supports construction only. There's a 5-year construction period. This includes things like infrastructure procurement and fabrication, testing, commissioning, and installation. So through construction. So there's 5 years to basically get it built. The operations and maintenance is actually separate. So obviously we build this thing in 5 years. We want it to run, and SZ4D aims to run the multi-hazard array for at least a decade. That is separate funding that comes from the directorates as opposed to the foundation level. So this is also an important constraint on our budget, as well as the $100 million cap. We need to make sure that the operations and maintenance of the multi-hazard array is acceptable to NSF Geo, and we are working to develop those estimates as well, and are in conversation with NSF about those estimates and what is realistic. So right now we're working a bit in the blind, because while we are aiming to target the next MSRI2 call, there is no solicitation yet. However, because this is such a large and complex proposal, are basically working on the assumption that the timeline will be similar to the last round of MSRI2, the 2023 cycle. So in that case, that would mean that a solicitation would show up sometime in spring of next year. Pre-proposals, which are something like 80 to 90% of the full proposals, would be due in June, with a full proposal, if invited, due later in the year. And there are, in the MSRI2, at least as in the previous cycles, some rounds after the submission of the full proposal, including review panels, but also conversations about refining the baseline budget, scope, schedule, and project execution plan. So this is a fairly long process, and we are assuming this. We are assuming we will submit to it, but it may be delayed. It may come out with very different requirements in the solicitation that we have not anticipated. So this may change, but this is our current plan that we are working towards. I will also say, just doing the math, so in this most optimistic timeline, we might expect, if successful, a decision something like 2027, which means construction would go to 2032. So this is a very, very long time span, like reaching the end of my career for this infrastructure. So it's a very long thing, but it's a major effort. So there's quite a bit of a process and a lot of detail that needs to go into it. So just to summarize, I know you're all interested in Cascadia, and I'll get to that, but I just want to summarize briefly what our current budget encapsulates for the main node in Chile for the multi-hazard array. This black box here shows you the main target region, going up into the flat slab and then down into south central Chile. And then on the right here, you can see the footprints of our subarrays targeted on earthquake hazard, going up into the flat slab, the volcano arrays, which extend through southern Chile, and also a few targets up in northern Chile, and then the surface array effort, which is again sort of centered in central south Chile. These general target regions were developed almost entirely based on input from AndesNet, which is our Chilean partner consortium. They've been very engaged with us, and they are formalizing their organization. We've had several meetings where they have basically had discussions among themselves as experts on this region, and given us recommendations that we've basically adopted in entirety. So ultimately, multi-hazard is more than the sum of these component subarrays. It's really meant to be a nested set of arrays within more of a backbone that's not as detailed here, but really to allow us both to target the best parts of Chile for the individual hazards, but also very, very importantly, to really make sure that they are linked together, that we are looking at them in the same context. So there's a bit of a distributed set of subarrays, but ultimately embedded closely enough together that we can integrate them and view this as a single instrument. Just to give you, I'm very quickly, I'm not going to go through the details here. This is the current snapshot of what the earthquake array in Chile looks like, with the dots representing the number of instruments in our current budget. We have OBS, APG, GNSSA, offshore, potentially offshore magnetotellurics, as well as onshore seismic GNSS, some arrays as well, and then a densification of this depending on regions of interest identified during the first more broad array that will really focus instruments in on key areas within the Chilean subduction zone. The Volk array comprises two components. One is a set of relatively sparse monitoring style networks on a large number of volcanoes, 22 volcanoes in Chile, including seismometers, GNSS, tilt, but also instruments that help us look at gas, thermal emissions, visual activity, ash collection, and so on. And then we have a plan for, in Chile, for large, dense imaging experiments, multi-parameter imaging experiments aimed to really look at the structure of the volcanoes. So those are 4 systems in Chile. We will be releasing the names of all of the potential target volcanoes, both in Chile and domestically, in the next coming weeks to the community for comments. So please keep a lookout for that if you're interested in knowing it. We're still going through some final internal vetting before we release that list. And then finally, the surface arrays are targeting 4 watersheds in Chile, looking at a range of behavior of both sediment, but also the hydrologic systems, looking at how sediment moves through these systems independently, but also in response to different events. So these are diagrams of various levels of instrumentation that will exist throughout these watersheds, and the watersheds again are meant to be comparative to each other, different conditions, different inputs, volcanic eruptions or not, and so on, really aiming to look at how mass movements happen and how that links into things like large earthquakes and volcanic eruptions as well. Okay, so the part that you're most interested in hearing about, what we're doing domestically. So this is just a summary here. I'll show you some location information for Cascadia in the next slide of what's currently in our budget or expected to be in our budget in the domestic sites. So for surface array, it's really meant to be more opportunistic, kind of rapid response in both Alaska and Cascadia. So we anticipate working with something like the Rapid facility to use instrumentation to respond to important mass movement events domestically. There will be bulk arrays as well, 3 volcano sensor arrays in Cascadia. So these are the sparse networks, 2 imaging efforts in Cascadia, and then some sensor array sparse networks in Alaska. Again, we will be releasing the potential targets in Cascadia in the coming weeks. And then in the earthquake array for the offshore, we envision, or we are planning for both OBS and GNSS-A, as well as onshore seismic and GNSS in Alaska. In Cascadia, currently our plans include a total of 9 GNSS-A and APGs, as well as 2 wave gliders. That is what is currently in our working budget model. And that is something that we would very much like to discuss and hear input on. Okay. So in terms of the potential target locations that SZ4D has been discussing in Cascadia, these were driven by 2 of 3 of the questions in the SZ4D implementation plan that I've shown here. What are the role of faults and terrains in the overriding plate in the strain budget, and what are their influence on megathrust behavior? This was something that FEC felt could be addressed in Cascadia. And then how do variations in coupling, how does coupling vary along strike and down dip in the Cascadia megathrust, and what is this linked to? So these are kind of the driving questions. And I refer you to the implementation plan in all of its 100-page glory for additional details. That is still our driving document that basically guides all of our scientific decision-making and infrastructure planning. Okay, possible Cascadia corridors. This is the latest that our Faulting and Earthquakes working group has provided to us. They have basically identified in Cascadia 3 corridors of interest, with the idea of locating 3 to 4 GNSS-A and APGs in each of these corridors. The first corridor is in northern Cascadia, just south of the Olympic Peninsula. And again, this is all offshore instrumentation, which is the widest locked zone. There's an opportunity to look at the overriding plate faults as well. We know that there are efforts to have advancements on the OOI cable here and so on. So this is where we're very interested in coordinating. In central Cascadia, this is the region that has been identified where there is thought to be a variation in locking and upper plate terrains that could be studied. And then in southern Cascadia, just north of the Gorda Plate boundary, the group felt that this would be a good place to look at the relationship between upper plate faulting and the megathrust. So this is as broad as the current thinking is in terms of SZ4D targets for our infrastructure in Cascadia. At this stage, we are very interested in trying to refine these based on other planned deployments, the community geodesy experiment, any plans to upgrade the OOI cable, and as well to, we have to consider logistics, bathymetry. We would like to kind of go where there are seismic lines, potentially where there is an opportunity to connect into the volcanic systems and watersheds. But we are very much interested in kind of optimizing our deployments to take the best advantage of what else is people are planning to put out over the long term. So this is very much a place for input for the FEC working group. Okay, and then just William asked me to mention, so again, just to remind you, we will have some onshore instrumentation planned, but these will be targeted on the volcanic systems in Cascadia. Probably most of interest is that we will be having these large footprint 2 to 3 year broadband seismic, nodal seismic arrays onshore on the volcanic arc in 2 places in Cascadia. All right, so let me shift now into talking about our current realities and our process going forward. At this point, we have spent a couple of years doing a budget modeling exercise with EarthScope based on kind of the best case scenario, the wish list cartoons, and we have now completed that budget model. And basically, we are at a point where we are confident that the entire wish list is not affordable given the $100 million cap on the MSRI2. There are lots and lots of uncertainties in that budget model. Again, we haven't taken into account any potential instruments that others are deploying or that exist in permanent networks. But we are ultimately at a point where we realize we do need to plan for budget and scope reduction to some extent. Even if we were comfortably within that $100 million cap, we would still be planning for budget and scope contingencies in case things get more expensive during construction and so on. So this is a normal part of this exercise. We need to prioritize and say what we would cut if we had to, but this is the stage that we're at. So again, we're very interested in finding out how we can kind of join resources with other independent efforts and you know, optimize where we put our sensors so that we can stay within this $100 million cap comfortably. The process going forward for us on this is that the working groups will be providing prioritizations. They will have the main role in providing guidance on if we have to cut something by 20%, you know, what goes first. We are also working diligently to refine the uncertainties in our budget model to make sure that we understand the exact cost of things, the cost of the logistics, the cost of the operations and maintenance. So those things are going on in parallel in the coming months. And I want to note, we have a very transparent process now for making these decisions. We have formal change control. Changes to our current budget have to be approved at various levels depending on their size. So it's not just me deleting APGs off the budget because I like them, but it's a process where it's transparent. Something is not going to disappear without documentation and input and discussion. And then of course, we are continuing to refine the experiment plan, specifically the targets, where we want things to go. Again, what are the highest priority locations, both for individual elements, but also for the multi-hazard array as a whole. I'll talk a bit in a slide or two about a proposal that we have in review to guide this effort. But again, this is something that our working groups are kind of the key point people on in terms of where are the highest priority targets, what are the best ways we can efficiently deploy these instruments in different, what is the best network design to get us to the science goals. Okay, so a part of what we're hoping to do also in this process is encapsulated in a proposal that we have currently in review at MG&G. I think I saw a lot of the work package leads in the audience here, but this is largely focused on Chile, but it's really our effort to use existing data and state-of-the-art models to assess what the needed instrument densities are, what are the best ways of deploying them, what configurations might we use so that we can really have the most efficient use of our resources, but again, meet our specified science success criteria for what we need to measure. A lot of this will be transferable and applied as well to Cascadia, even though it is largely focused on Chile. So that is pending, and we're hoping to hear on that. That was submitted in May. Okay, and then this is a bit sort of repetitive here, just again, our scope plan, again, will be guided by our design proposal. We'll be assessing what infrastructure exists and might be available to us so that we don't have to kind of redundantly deploy instruments. We will be looking both through the design proposal and on our own and to how we can basically have multi-use instruments. So a seismometer serves the watershed community, the volcano community, and the earthquake community. And can we find locations that satisfy that? We'll be looking at trade-offs between spatial coverage and spatial density, again, with our science goals as written on in our implementation plan in mind. And again, the working groups will be the key people guiding this. Okay, and just to sum up, a couple of last slides. So I'm talking largely about our construction phase. Again, that is what the MSRI2 is meant to cover, but we will ultimately transition at the end of this to an operations phase, and we need to think about decommissioning. Our hope is that all instruments in the plan will operate for a minimum of 10 years in place. We plan for our domestic data to be openly available. This is a community data set as soon as we can, depending on what type of telemetry and servicing intervals we have. We will be making this immediately open to everyone. It might look a little different in Chile, depending on our ongoing conversations with various agencies mandated for hazards there. But ultimately, all of this will be freely open and available data to the entire scientific community. We are currently working on our data management plan and our cyber infrastructure. We plan to budget for cyber infrastructure development and construction in the MSRI2. In addition to the raw data and metadata, we are also starting to discuss what limited data products, either single-time data products like station calibrations or corrections, or what ongoing data products might be most of use to the community. These would be very limited, not very detailed, something that will basically allow people to discover things within the data sets. And again, this is a place where your input is very, very much welcome. And then finally, we do have to describe a decommissioning plan. We have to tear this thing down. It has to end. Right now, SZ4D really favors long-term adoption. We would like these instruments to operate indefinitely where they are, if to the extent that is possible at the end of the project. But of course, that depends on agencies that are willing and able to take them over and continue to fund their operation. An alternative would be returning to instrument pools. Again, we are having these conversations with various agencies, and we're looking at what is possible, but your input is very much welcome. But this is our kind of priority goal, is to have these basically exist indefinitely as long-term or permanent stations. Okay, how to stay engaged and informed with us. We have a town hall at AGU on Wednesday evening. We have a lot of events, but one of them is a town hall. We'll have updates there. We'll actually have a dedicated breakout session on the MSRI. We'll give you updates and you can provide input, so come talk with us. We have, prior to the January USGS Subduction Zone Science Workshop in Seattle, we have a part-day stakeholder meeting. This is an invite-only meeting. CRESCENT reps and other reps from Cascadia initiatives have indicated that they will attend. So this is an important place for us to continue this dialogue about siting, long-term plans, and so on. So we already have the next step in place for talking with the domestic stakeholders, such as CRESCENT. And you can always email us thoughts or insults or questions or anything you like. We do have a new page on our website for infrastructure planning, where we are going to try to put updates as soon as we can. We put everything out in front of the community at some point with a call for feedback. And so that's going to be a place where we'll do that, as well as our listserv. But I just want to end by saying you're always welcome to email me or the OPCI chairs or the OPCI committee or the working groups. The simplest way to do that is through our kind of generic email, and that will get routed to the right group or people. So please, this is very important for us that you give us feedback and tell us what you want and what you think we should be considering. So I'll end there. I went a little long, apologies, and we can take any questions at this point. And I'll ask Doug and Jeff and anybody else from SZ4D to help with the technical stuff here.
Okay, thanks very much. I think for questions, people can either type them in the chat or I think raise their hand. That might be the best, since we got a recording of it.
Okay, I see a couple in the chat from Joan. What instruments are envisioned for the onshore Cascadia, Alaska earthquake component? Sorry if you said this. We don't have any plans for onshore Cascadia earthquake instrumentation. We do have the volcano sensors. In Alaska, there is a plan for both GNSS and seismic onshore in the same region where we plan to put offshore geodesy and seismic. Funding the deployment costs, this is part of the MSRI budget for including personnel for Cascadia and Alaska.
So on the Alaska component, then what is the instrumentation, the onshore instrumentation specified, the type?
broadband seismic and GNSSA.
Just
For onshore?
online
Just
GNSS.
onshore GNSS,
Just
yeah,
onshore.
broadband
Onshore.
seismic.
Oh,
and
sorry, onshore GNSS. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So it's all conventional stuff. Okay, thank you.
I see a question from David Schmidt about APGs. I think it's actually all, I think all the discussions of APGs were drift corrected instruments. Is that correct, Diana?
So what we're budgeting for is A0A, and we are also looking, at least in Chile, at ocean circulation modeling to look at how much we can reduce noise there. So maybe that addresses your question. Okay.
There's some questions. There's some
oh,
questions from Jesse Hutchinson. Do the number of offshore GNSS stations include 3 transponders each?
I'm pretty sure
Jeff?
the answer is yes.
Yeah.
I think they were budgeted as sort of standard 3 transponder arrays per site.
Yeah, that's my recollection.
And then he wondered whether there was any interest in putting them further offshore on the Juan de Fuca plate.
I think this is where we could get some discussion. What are the benefits of putting them further offshore, given that to put one further offshore, you might need to reduce the number in the current locations, potentially. But what would be the trade-offs? What would be the advantages of having some that are further offshore versus in other locations?
And then the final question was, have the interest been aligned with the current distribution of GNSSA stations that have been running for several years? And I assume that's up for discussion too. But
so these particular transects were recommended by FEC. I was not involved in all of their meetings, but I believe that they were entirely aware of where existing instruments were already placed, both for Cascadia and Alaska. So, it'd be useful for people to weigh in on whether you think they did a good job of siting these transects, taking into account what was already there. But yes, they did take into account what already existed. That does kind of make some assumption that perhaps those things will somehow continue, and I think that becomes maybe another question for discussion. There's sort of one cost associated with sending a wave glider out to interrogate the arrays, and a different sort of level of cost that's involved in adding arrays or replacing batteries with new ones and so on. But it would be good to hear what people think about the what's currently funded, about the existing sites, and yeah, how important is it to continue observations of those sites beyond whatever is currently funded?
Some questions from Harold and Renate about de-scoping. Do we plan to keep the current the percentage balance, and will we focus on Chile only? Again, our ideal would be that the instruments that were deployed in Chile stay where they are if there is Chilean interest and support for those, and the things that are in Alaska and Cascadia stay where they are. That said, this is a conversation that we'll be having mostly in January, February, thinking about long-term adoption. We're also working to find out from NSF how detailed we have to be on this, but I think the vision and the conversations to date have been the Chile stuff stays in Chile, the domestic stuff stays domestic. That said, there is interest, I think, in Chile, certainly for that. But it's also a kind of a question of longer term resources that is a little bit beyond our control.
Yeah,
I think the question there was
a different question, I think, that was asked.
Yeah.
I think the question was, for example, let's suppose that we find out that we're 30% over budget and we have to remove 30% of our proposed scope. Do we simply remove everything that's not Chile?
Yeah.
We're at 70%, we're in balance, or do we de-scope everything proportionally? I think the guidance, as I would understand it from the previous round of SZ4D science planning was that we'd have to descope everything to some extent, that we wouldn't be eliminating entirely Cascadia or Alaska.
Yeah, that's my understanding. Again, this is a conversation that we're starting with the working groups now in terms of prioritization, but I think all along there has been a strong feeling of, we need to target something in these three areas. And I have not heard any discussion of, well, let's just not go to Cascadia.
I think that's true.
Yeah.
I mean, particularly the way politics is moving in this country, I think we would be very, it would be very bad to sort of get rid of the domestic part of this project.
Yeah, I don't see that as a likely possibility at all. But again, ultimately, it's guidance from our working groups, and they are starting those conversations. We do not currently have plans for DAS, or we do not have budget. We have not budgeted DAS infrastructure. That said, we are in discussions around the planned Humboldt cable in Chile and access to that. But that is not in the current SC4D MSRI2 budget. So I think that is very much an interest for longer term and earthquake early warning as well. And there are opportunities for that in Chile, but that's a bit outside the scope, but it is a conversation that is happening.
So Matt,
yeah, Matt, or somebody else chime in here.
Matt Way asked a question about the data policy for the Chilean data.
Yes. Okay. Yes. So ultimately, the Chilean data will be open. The only discussion there that we've had is a short embargo on data, in particular from volcanoes. Short would be something like a month. So the data would simply be lagged for open community-wide access for approximately a month. I don't think there is an issue around any other data from Chile. So given the extent to which we can afford to telemeter in real time, which may not be, there might be some latency, but ultimately those data would be open, but there may be some parts just to respect mandates for monitoring and some sensitivities with our Chilean government agency partners. There might be some short-term embargoes on some parts of the data, mostly the volcano monitoring data.
And David had a question about high resolution bathymetric mapping near the deformation front as an important baseline data set.
So I think
go ahead, Jeff.
I think that's an activity as opposed to infrastructure, as NSF defines it. My understanding is that if we need a high resolution bathymetric mapping of some small area in order to site an instrument in an exact spot, that's installation of infrastructure. But in general, doing a bathymetric survey is an activity. So Donna can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that actually falls under the other heading because of the way that NSF has a relatively specific definition of what constitutes infrastructure. So
right, no, that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that's also kind of a reminder that the infrastructure proposal can't do all of the things that people want. And the definitions between what can be in and cannot be in really have to follow NSF specific definitions. And so it's not everything that we need. Our folks at EIR are certainly aware of that. And they've been asking us to tell them about what are the things you need that can't fit under infrastructure. So we're making them aware of that, but there's going to have to be some other mechanism for getting those kinds of things funded.
Okay. And then there's a question one about balancing infrastructure between volcanoes.
So the idea here is
scope, but we can deal with it.
Yeah, a little outside of scope, but just real quickly, and Glenning, if you want to email me, we can chat about this, or Jeff is familiar, but Jeff Abers. The idea is to have exactly the same instrumentation, or as close as possible, on all of these 30 sensor arrays, because we're really after comparative volcanology and looking at different parts of the volcanic cycle. Again, with the imaging experiments, the goal is, to try to do exactly the same experiment, same density, same types of instruments, on the 6 target volcanoes, again, with an eye towards comparative work. But I'm happy to chat with you offline if you want to email me or ask Jeff because he knows a lot about that.
Okay, questions keep on coming in. We probably need to get into breakout groups soon, but opportunities for using boreholes to install long-term instrumentation, existing boreholes. Question about, is there any chance of doing anything in Canadian waters?
I don't think we've had conversations about boreholes, Jeff or Doug or anybody else from FEC. I think it, again, will really depend on this work that kind of looks at where we need to put things in the best way. And if there's something opportunity there that fits and is a budget saver, or there's a strong justification, it's an interesting thing to consider.
Yeah, I think that's
Anything
correct. I don't think there's been much discussion about putting instrumentation in boreholes. I mean, you have to have specific instrumentation developed to go into boreholes, so it's unlikely that we would do a one-off, instrument in order to take advantage of one borehole somewhere.
What about doing stuff in Canadian waters? Is that under consideration, or is that?
I think the corridors are all in the target corridors are all in on the US side of the border. I believe we have a few folks from Canada coming to our conversation in Seattle, and certainly coordinating, again, thinking about the bigger picture of what exists in different regions and how we might, build something or complement something in a way that's useful. That's a very welcome discussion, but I don't think there's a plan to extend SZ4D instrumentation into Canada or Canadian waters.
Okay. So the very last question we'll do is from Diego, how are you approaching or reaching out to local scientists, i.e. people from state agencies, to solicit input on targets that might be of interest to them?
Right. This might be more of a volcano question, or we are in communication with the Cascades Volcano Observatory. We have invited a number of folks, I think, including from the state agencies, to our conversation in January. But this is a good point and something that we will make sure that is happening. I think we have talked with somebody from Dogami, but yes, I think maybe we're pending a little more refinement on the high priority scientific targets to have those conversations.
Okay, great. I think we've now exhausted the questions. And
Thank you,
so
everyone.
we're gonna split up into breakout groups. There are breakout notes